Welcome to the final video in the Cold War series, looking at the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Firstly, a bit of background. Part of Gorbachev's policy of perestroika or new thinking was the end of Brezhnev doctrine, where the Soviet Union would intervene in other states' affairs if they felt that communism was threatened. Gorbachev had intended for this to strengthen the USSR's ability to compete economically with the West, but it had the unintended consequence of also showing the Soviet satellite states that the USSR would no longer intervene in challenges to communism as it had done in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Also, glasnost or openness encouraged the open questioning of communist ideas and government, which further undermined communist governments in the satellite states. Within 12 months of his speech to the UN, communist governments all over Central and Eastern Europe had been dismantled. Let's have a look at the process by which that happened. This slide has got the potential to become very busy indeed, so I'm going to be going through all of the events one at a time in broadly chronological order. After that though, I'll put up all the information all at once, so if you want to pause this or take a screenshot or whatever to make some notes or just read it through for yourself, you'll have the ability to do that. Okay, let's begin. We're going to start in Hungary. In May 1989, the border fence with Austria came down. Free elections were held in October, which ended the communist government there. Remember that Austria was not a communist country, and so this was a common crossing over place for people who wanted to escape communism. Essentially, by taking down the fence, Hungary were allowing this. Then we got the events in Poland. The opposition Solidarity Party was legalised and went on to win a landslide election victory in June 1989. This is the big one though, East Germany. There's a lot happened here. Let's start with September 1989. There was a huge movement of people leaving for the German Democratic Republic or East Germany to go to the West, often through Hungary and Austria. 125,000 people crossed the border on September the 11th alone. That led in October 1989 for Gorbachev refusing to help the GDR government suppress opposition against it. And then in November 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Rumours that the border in Berlin would be opened prompted thousands of people to force their way through the Berlin Wall and then demolish it. The guards were not going to open fire. Germany was reunified formally in 1990. What about Czechoslovakia though? Their revolution in 1968 had failed, but in November 1989 the communist government was overthrown by the so-called Velvet Revolution. Anti-communist Václav Havel was elected. And in Romania, there was more bloodshed. There were anti-communist demonstrations, which escalated to the point that Ceausescu, the dictator, was overthrown and executed. In Bulgaria in 1989, communist leader Mladenov resigned. Free elections were held in 1990, again ending the communist leader's government and ending communism in Bulgaria. And that's a common theme, given the chance the people of Central Europe were turning away from communism. And then there's Yugoslavia. Again, there's rather a bloody story, this one. December 1990, Slovenians voted to be independent. This led to the later breakup of Yugoslavia into Slovenia, Croatia, Montenegro, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo and Macedonia in a series of declarations in the 1990s. This is something that I really clearly remember from my early childhood and finding quite upsetting on the news, because often this was against the backdrop of bloody civil wars and violence. And whenever you heard people talking about the former Yugoslavia, you thought about those struggles. There are still tensions in this part of the world today, but this is effectively the last wounds trying to be healed by the post-Second World War period. So there's a lot that's gone on here, and in a moment I'm going to show all of this information all at once, so if you want to take some notes, you can do so. Here's all the information. Take the notes that you want, take a screenshot if you like, and then move on when you're ready. We're then going to have a look at some of the case studies of what happened at the end of the Cold War. We'll start with perhaps the most famous example, the fall of the Berlin Wall. It all started as a rumour. After months of pressure to open borders, with hundreds of thousands of people fleeing East Germany, largely through Hungary and Austria, a clumsily handled press conference on the 9th of November 1989 opened the checkpoints of the Berlin Wall to a flood of ecstatic Germans. There were emotional reunions between friends and family who had been separated from one another for over 30 years. All over Europe, communist governments were already collapsing. The fall of the Berlin Wall did not cause that, and it did not change that. However, in the same way that the Berlin Wall had become a symbol of the Cold War ever since its construction in 1961 and Kennedy's speech in 1963. Its fall was symbolic of the end of the Cold War too. In terms of the politics of Europe, though, the end of the Warsaw Pact was just as important. Since 1955, Europe had been militarily as well as politically divided. In response to the creation of the NATO alliance, the USSR and satellite states had created the Warsaw Pact to counteract NATO. However, the Warsaw Pact had also had a big role in enforcing Soviet control of the satellite states. When Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 had challenged communist dominance, it was Warsaw Pact troops who had put down that opposition. As the satellite states declared independence between 1989 and 1991, the Iron Curtain separating Europe between communism in the east and capitalism in the west drew back. This ended the need for military cooperation, and the Warsaw Pact formally dissolved in July 1991. Every single member of the pact abandoned communism. The Cold War was all but over. With the collapse of communist governments all over Central Europe, the end of the Soviet Union was in sight. The loss of the satellite states was a major blow to Gorbachev's authority. Hardline communists blamed Gorbachev's policies of perestroika and glasnost for allowing the satellite states to break away from the influence of the USSR. When the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia declared independence in 1990, Gorbachev's position became basically untenable. In August 1991, there was an attempted coup against Gorbachev. Boris Yeltsin, seen on the left in the photograph there, coordinated a response which defeated the coup and kept Gorbachev in power, but what little authority he still had was in tatters. All 12 leaders of the Soviet republics joined together to form the Commonwealth of Independent States. On December the 25th, 1991, Gorbachev resigned, and virtually immediately the Soviet Union broke apart. The Cold War was over. The West was still standing, the Soviet Union had collapsed. By that metric, the West had emphatically won. However, we still live with the consequences of the Cold War to this day. The world had come through the threat of nuclear war unscathed, and communism in Europe had collapsed. But all this was only just over 30 years ago. In historical terms, that's the blink of an eye. The aftershocks rumble on. But it is not the purpose of this video to go through those. So, for the final time in this series, let's consider our final points. Gorbachev's policies of perestroika, meaning new thinking, and glasnost, meaning openness, had the unintended consequence of giving the Soviet satellite states the chance to leave the influence of the USSR and abandon communism. Between 1989 and 1991, all of these states abandoned communism. Some of these countries gained independence peacefully through elections, such as Hungary and Poland. For some, such as Romania and Yugoslavia, the process was a lot more bloody. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 became symbolic of the end of communism in Europe and the end of the Cold War. The collapse of communism in Europe led to the dismantling of the Warsaw Pact. And the end of the Warsaw Pact and loss of USSR influence over European countries contributed to Gorbachev's downfall. Gorbachev's downfall in December 1991 led to the collapse of the USSR. The Cold War was over. And so is this series. Except there will be a couple more videos looking at the exam skills necessary to actually pass the course, so do look out for those as well. But if this video and this series has been helpful to you, please do thank the channel by liking the video and best of all subscribing to the channel. It really does help. And it will help me pay me back for all the extra effort I've put into this while I do my full-time history teaching job. But enough begging from me. If you've got any other things that you really want me to cover, you never know, I might just be able to do it. So pop it in the comments below. But for now, thanks very much for watching, and I'll say goodbye.